Welcome to today's webinar, Why Care? What should be the limits to public subsidies and economic development? Well, that's the old title. I think the title we really should be working with is how is urbanization shaping Alberta's future? Economic development is certainly part of it, but not only. And our focus, well, several of our newsletters and dozens of the associated webinars this year have explored the urban impact of urbanization. And you might recall in October, we discussed homelessness in great detail. It's not a unique urban problem, but it certainly is well known and getting a lot of attention. But the other side of the impact is what's being left behind, the plight of rural communities. And that's really what I think we'd like to focus on today. As I indicated in the newsletter, I'd taken a trip out to rural Alberta a week or so ago, and I wasn't surprised at much, but I was reminded that there is such a thing as rural Alberta. And what's going on out there is rather profound, not surprising to many. And we're not going through a bust right now, which would probably make it more profound. But there's a transition underway, and it is apparent as a byproduct of urbanization. I'd like to talk about it more today. So we don't have a presentation, we have just a chat. And in that just a chat, I'd like to get various perspectives. And I'm going to pick on a couple of you because we have had this discussion during the week. And I'm going to ask Yogi, maybe if you don't mind, you brought a perspective forward. Maybe it's just black and white. Maybe there's a lot of gray in here. But anyway, Yogi, what's your perspective on the plight of rural Alberta during this transition?
As you've alluded to, there's a huge number of themes in this discussion. One of them is that we've had this trend from rural to urban for millennia. This has been going on for. And that's because there's a bunch of things like quality of life and income that is very appealing in an urban setting to many individuals, millions, billions, depending on how you want to count. And we've observed this in Alberta as well as in the other prairie provinces for the last century or so. And as productivity has increased, the number of people you need to look after the land and whatever processing industry or transportation may be there keeps going down. So the number of people that are there, it keeps going down. Now, understandably, the people that are left are clamoring for the same quality of service that people in an urban setting enjoy. And that's impossible to deliver at any price level or government subsidy level, however you want to pay for that. So I think this trend is going to level out simply because there are going to be very few people left in a rural setting. Now in Alberta, we've had the advantage that we also have oil and gas operations in this rural setting, and that has supported way more families out there than in other regions of the planet where that kind of employment is not available.
You highlighted the what's behind this migration. I mean, we could also add to this the advantages of having advanced education centers where people looking for further ed go to our university or our college, most of which were initially located in our urban centers, but have been, as a government policy, attempting to repopulate or keep populations where they are, have tried to put the Athabasca universities and the Olds and whatever out into the, I won't call them necessarily rural, but to move them out of the cities and help sustain or draw populations to it. You might recall recently Athabasca University, which was set up in Athabasca, was an attempt to develop such a center, but the staff didn't actually move out to Athabasca.
Right. If I'm a credible academic, how would my career or my quality of life be enhanced by moving out to Athabasca? That's a really tough sell. The same way it's a tough sell to encourage certain medical practitioners to move out there. Now, you also gave the example of Olds, and we could use examples like Stettler or Leduc or Wainwright or Wetaskiwin. Maybe if we're determined to to distribute the population a little bit, we could subsidize high-speed transportation more. Because that would, like if we had high-speed transportation in the Calgary to Edmonton corridor, or more suburban high-speed transportation like Airdrie, Strathmore, Okotoks, Cochrane, that would enhance the quality of life and the feasibility of living there, because you still have some feasible ties to a urban center with all its amenities and services that appeal to you.
But this is what brings economic development into the core, is if you can put, as they did in Red Cliff, a meat packing plant and bring immigrants in from elsewhere to staff that operation, you have an economic strategy, or you do what you have alluded to, and that is, when the time is right, put that economic corridor into place that's been talked about between Edmonton and Calgary for many years, as a
Okay,
strategy.
so meat packing, we're doing exactly what you just said in Brooks and in Alderside. Makes great sense to me.
So one of the questions one might ask is, why bother? If you're a cynic, you might say, well, are those meat plants being subsidized? Are they competitive? Are they only there because Trudeau came in with 25 million to finance a battery making plant? I mean, are we really wasting current taxpayers' money when the inevitable death or ghosting of much of rural Canada is going to take place on its own? Is it inevitable? And if it is inevitable, do we give them a chance to commit suicide, or do we help them and hire funeral directors instead of economic development officers? I'm going to ask George just to jump in here, because Yogi, you and I have batted this baseball or ping pong ball back and forth most of the week, but
Yeah, let's hear from somebody else.
well, I'd like to bring George in because George has been in the front lines. You and I, Yogi, talk about this almost from an academic perspective of what if and what we have read. But George, you've been in the front lines. What's your perspective on what's driving this and what might be done about it?
Well, some of what you've already said is obviously some of the both obvious and inevitable, and that's that small rural communities suffer because young families are no longer as needed on farms as they were in the early days, where farms required the additional family units to support the farm and to keep the farm going. Now farmers are realizing that they can farm much larger territories without the necessity of young family members coming along and running the tractors and combines and so on. They have huge farms, some of them massive farms throughout Alberta, depending on location. But so that's one of the issues, is simply that farming has become a more high intensity, high mechanized delivery system, as opposed to highly reliant on human resources. So that's one of the things or factors. The second issue is to consider is the political side of this. Political side of this, in my mind, is that the provincial government, particularly the current government, is reliant upon rural members who will consistently support rural communities because they know they have to in order to get reelected. So you've got a big push within caucus in Alberta, at least, and I think in Saskatchewan is also the same, where they're saying we can't afford to let rural communities dry up. We've got to do all we can to support them, pump money into them, and so on. The Alberta government, unlike the Saskatchewan government, is at least somewhat realistic because they do viability studies to see whether or not small rural villages, hamlets are still viable, some of which aren't, as you've noted earlier. And so those communities have been allowed to dissolve and become part of their larger rural neighbor. One quick example, of course, is Wabamun, which is a nice little village that couldn't sustain itself, and so now it's part of Parkland County. He's probably got better access to better resources, better equipment, all of that than it's ever had, and it would be highly unlikely to go back to a hamlet status. It doesn't like the fact that it's lost some of its verbal clout by having a council and the mayor and so on. But that's sort of a sacrifice that they've made in order to become more viable for the folks that are living there. So I think a couple of things, Perry. One is that just based on pure politics, you're going to consistently have rural communities that are going to struggle for survival, but they're going to be propped up by a provincial government that basically is somewhat supportive of the fact that they're there and that they're in some respects needed, at least politically. The second point is that rural communities dot the landscape because at one point they were very valuable. They were an interchange on a particular Trans-Canada highway or railway line, some of which have now vanished. I think of where my wife was born and down in the Hilda, Alberta area outside of Medicine Hat, where the rail line used to go right through town, and now, of course, is some distance away from town. But the village is making a bit of a comeback because people in Medicine Hat realize that being in the city is not all that attractive for some of them, and so they move out to the rural area. So I think you've got different forces at work that you need to take into account. It's not simply economic, it's also lifestyle choices. And I think people might more and more be encouraged to move up to where the lifestyle is less hectic. You could put in some really good seniors places, I suspect, in rural Alberta, and have that as an attraction as long as you've got access to medical care and shopping, and that may or may not be possible. So if you look at can you survive if they're only surviving on grants from the provincial government, and I think Dennis Pullman will tell you the same thing. If they're relying on grants to survive, then that's an artificial prop up, and it quite frankly is doomed to failure at some point because governments change. The NDP government could come back into power and decide that no, we're not going to do that any longer. We're not going to prop up small communities because after all, they don't vote for us in the first place. So I think there's really a political pull to this. There's a nostalgic pull to this. There's a let's live in rural Canada pull to this. And yet the inevitable forces that happen with regard to large scale cities, big universities, big colleges, young people moving away to go to college, university, finding jobs, families are decimated. And so the average population reduces, the urban population increases. What rural communities have going for it is called linear assessment, which is the underground pipelines that run past rural municipalities, and they get a truckload of assessment value out of those. And so they don't need to tax their residents anywhere near to the extent that we do in Spruce Grove or St. Albert or surrounding areas, because we don't have access to the same linear that they do. So there's a lot of push and pull to all of this. It's not a simple equation. It's not an easy one for us, a panel of august thinkers, to resolve in the course of an hour, because it's gone on for quite some time.
The point of subsidies, I mean, one can make sense that if there's a shock or that people aren't quite ready, that a subsidy might be used in order to facilitate planning and preparation, but they can't go on forever. Otherwise, they form a dependency. You mentioned the provincial government here in Alberta is doing viability studies. That was keen to hear that.
Yeah.
There are consequences as a byproduct of getting a failing grade or whatever. What do they then do? What do they mandate that they have to talk to their neighbors? What is the consequence of being identified as no longer viable?
Well, two quick responses, and I'll pass it over to somebody else. But one is that provincial government, you're allowed as a municipality to appeal to the province on behalf of your council, on behalf of your residents. There's a variety of techniques for drivers to ask the government, will you please do a dissolution study and see whether or not the village, the hamlet, is still keen to maintain its hamlet or village incorporated status, in other words, which is village on up. And typically that means 1,500 population on up. That's the one question. And so they send out a viability team. The province does. They have that buried inside municipal affairs. And that team goes out. They do a pretty thorough job. They try to give an assessment. And they come back to the province and they say, yes, it's viable, or no, it's not. And yeah, we should allow this vote to go ahead, and we'll find out whether or not the citizens are keen to dissolve. And so by the time you've identified that, you've had public engagement. The public has spoken up on both sides of the equation, and then they're asked to vote. And I think out of the 26 dissolution studies in the last 12 to 24 months, I think 13 of them have decided to dissolve, which means you've got half of them that have decided to stay incorporated because they prefer local autonomy to having better paved streets and better garbage, water, sewer services. So that's, in my mind, and there will be increasingly pressure, I think, on the province to allow for some dissolution. I think you really need to look at it in the case of, do we have the kind of resources in a small community to provide the services, basic services that are necessary? Can we provide those services on our own, or do we need to be propped up by provincial government funding in order to survive? If it is at that point, then I think you're probably better off as a province to allow the municipality to dissolve and to allow it to be taken over by its larger neighbor. By the way, the other point to be made is not all larger neighbors want to take them over. So, this is a two-way street. The second thing the province has done is to mandate intermunicipal collaboration. So if you're going to do any planning and you're going to do any economic development, you've got to have an intermunicipal collaboration agreement or framework, and that's now in the Municipal Government Act, so it's now the law. So that encourages rural municipalities to share their resources and their richness with some of their urban neighbors. But there's obviously a push and pull to that, but that's now part of the legal suite that we have in province of Alberta.
You've touched on something that I think we're going to see in the data that we're gathering, and Dawn's helping. When I'm distributing this, Dawn's taking a look, gathering the data. But one of the things that I think we're seeing early on is the difference in acknowledged responsibilities of the importance of revenue generation or economic development by the CAO.
Yeah.
The governing bodies or the councils are indicating that the more important issues from their perspective are issues that are truly issues of governance that relate to things like amalgamation and relationships with the provincial government, et cetera. So we've got a dichotomy of the relevance or importance of issues. Now, whether that's a problem or not, one's got to presume that these parties are all working toward a common end. But if this constitutes a schism, obviously council is probably going to win, and the CAO's objectives of economic development or revenue generation are going to fall by the wayside. Is this an issue that we're likely to see as one tours around the province?
Well, I think you're going to see in many communities, they don't have the resources to hire economic development officers to go out and flog the countryside to try to find economic development opportunity. So some of that simply will come to the community itself because they want lots of land, they want access to railway tracks, they want the community to be supportive, and they have a large enough population base to staff the organization, i.e. the meat packing plant that's going to come in. So some of that is CAO recommendation up to council. Council makes the political decision. Are we in favor? Are we not? Typically, they probably would be. The economic development officer is a luxury for small communities because that role would probably be combined with other roles inside the municipality in order to be justifiable. So I would argue that the economic developer of the community does their best to get the name of the community out, to connect with potential industries and commerce and so on. I think in many cases it's of limited value. You really need to ask whether or not this is of usefulness. I mean, I recall in the old days when they'd all come off to conferences and hand out business cards and promo brochures on behalf of municipalities, but they'd be handing them off to each other, so because the audience they were trying to attract would be industry and businesses that might come to their area. And you made the point earlier with regard to Athabasca University, which was one that Spruce Grove, when I was mayor, took a run at, only to find out, of course, that it was largely politically driven and they'd already decided it was going to be in Athabasca. Similarly to the correspondence school that went to Barrhead, was another one that we took a run at. And eventually, I think I phoned the province and I said, next time when you've already decided the issue, take our name off the list in terms of wanting us to submit a proposal, because it's a lot to do about nothing. You've already decided where it's going to go. I think the name was already picked. Athabasca University should give a pretty good indication where it might land, and that would be part of the giveaway. But anyway, I agree with Yogi's comment earlier. Just is that where the academics are going to want to be located? And Athabasca has a lot of good things going for it. Same with Barrhead. But is that really going to be the center of the universe for people that are academically inclined? It's much more likely to be Edmonton, Calgary, Red Deer. So
I'd like to come back to the role of the economic development officer for a moment. I mean, like a doctor who has an ethic, thou shalt do no harm, and is there to pursue almost everlasting life, to not be taking life unless it gets legislated. An economic development officer looking at the corporate body of a municipality or of a corporation. Do we prepare economic development officers to, from time to time, be funeral directors? at some point in time, one needs to acknowledge that the end is near, and you would hire someone or you would engage someone to guide you to make sure that you have an orderly transition as people leave. Now, I know in Eastern Canada, they've actually moved people. They've moved the Inuit population either back up in order to repopulate or move them out to Newfoundland. But that's rather dramatic, and I'm not sure anybody would be able to pull that off today. But what do economic development officers have a role, and have they been trained in how to help wind down a community?
I think the answer to the second part of that question is no. I think the value that they add is to raise the profile, to raise the awareness of Kumquat, Alberta, as being a viable place for you to locate your business because it has adequate land base, it has a grain elevator, it has a main street, it has a bank, it has whatever, and we're going to tout that as being part of our sell in order to get the business to come and live here. And as long as the business doesn't require services and people that we don't have, then you can make that argument. It's just you've got to be very selective in terms of making the argument because you're not going to get big industry coming into a very small community if they need access to services that are simply not there. You're not going to import the services with you. You're going to import the business. So I think a lot of the focus has got to be a lot more targeted if you're going to be successful in that economic development attraction business.
I know.
And you've got to work regionally. I think that's what's happened.
Well, we saw the reluctance of the telecommunications industry to bear the cost. We've seen Greyhound reluctant to bear the cost. We've seen CN and CP reluctant to bear the cost when it's no longer economically viable to them as a corporation to build the infrastructure, that is to pay for the lines, or to sustain operationally the deficits of maintaining services to a rural community that can no longer sustain that. So that is pure economics. I know they closed down Pine Point up in the Northwest Territories when the mine was over, or Nordegg or wherever. Often that town of Hershey, Pennsylvania, when Hershey is gone, will be gone itself. But is it a shock? Does it always have to be a shock? Or is the provincial government in this instance well aware, and it sounds like it is in Alberta, that ghosting is a reality and it needs to be done in an orderly fashion. Now, the oil and gas industry has created a significant issue with the abandoned wells and with the fact that boom and bust, they can make a community viable. But when Saudi Arabia or Russia or a war elects, that community finds itself suffering again.
Yes. Yep.
So the concentration in these communities when they think they've got a win, and all of a sudden a COVID hits and their economy goes to hell, they've got a significant problem. That they are subject to the whims of those elsewhere in the world. They're not very viable when that's the case. Dawn, when we look at the data, for those of us that are well aware that survey is underway, I'm rather excited to see the response rate so far. That's an indication that we have caught attention. So we sent out 317 surveys. We've done it 2-3 times now. We're going to do it again at the end of the month as a deadline approaches. But we're up at 100 responses. I think that's where we're doggone near that. And it looks like it's fairly widespread, although a dominance, of course, of rural Alberta versus urban just by sheer numbers. But anything in just the way that survey is going, Dawn, you want to share?
Well, it's interesting, because we sent out the 2 surveys and there was a difference in the response rates to either one, but now they're absolutely even, which is great. Yeah. And it seems like some days we get just tremendous jumps, with 10 more people filling out the survey. And I'm really encouraged because I think we've already got a really good response rate, and I like the way that people are filling it out because they're giving us the ratings and they're giving us lots of open-ended comments. So there's a story there.
Yeah, I think the open-ended comments, I took a look at some of that. I think that's where ChatGPT, Jeff, will help us, is synthesizing an awful lot of text. It used to be one of the biggest problems you had with an open-ended question, but now I'm not worried about open-ended questions at all.
Yeah.
Maybe even give us some images.
Yeah.
But the other thing is we sent the survey out to CAOs and urging them to also engage their counselors, and that's taken place. I've had a few phone calls from counselors just acknowledging that they knew who we were, or they knew George was, or who I am. So it's touched them. I think they felt it's timely and relevant. They are, of course, asking, what are we going to do with this?
Yeah.
The intent among some of us has been not to finish the survey and call it in any way final, or to even perhaps include a final list of recommendations until engaging a Yuma and rural municipalities, and maybe economic development of Alberta, so they feel engaged in taking this forward, whether that they're taking it to their members for fine tuning and further engagement, or taking it to the province, or just taking it public. A very good report came out yesterday from University of Calgary. I think I forget the individual's name, but good report on exactly this topic. So it is topical and it's timely. I asked him if he would join us today, and unfortunately he was going to another event where he said he would. So when we finish the study, I will certainly ask him to join us and participate in the discussion of our results vis-a-vis his own. Mel, anything you want to add in terms of this discussion from an economic or social or AI perspective?
Maybe from sort of a social perspective, going back to sort of basic principles, you sort of ask yourselves, why are small towns where they are? Well, there's got to be a reason. There's maybe a coal seam somewhere, so there's a mine that started. There's a lot of people have to work there, so they built a little town, and they do the thing that everyone has to do. They have hospitals, fire departments, all that type of stuff. If I go back to my high school days, I went to high school up in northern Quebec. It was a town up there, about 5,000 people, iron mining, about 6 or 7 open pit iron mines. And over the years, those mines got depleted. And the town was run by a manager, no real council, but there were half a dozen people that essentially said what we had to pay to kind of keep the thing running. And when I say we, I'm talking about my parents at that time. But the mines started dwindling down a little bit. The production, well, they closed quite a few of them, and they were essentially depleted. So the town, if I look at it with Google Earth right now, over half of it is bulldozed away. Some really great houses, a nice hotel and everything, all gone. So the reason for that town to exist is gone, so the town essentially went away. Out on the west coast, where I went to for my first job up in Kitimat, Eurocan was a pulp and paper company. It shut down in 2010. The town had a population of about 15,000 people. Alcan, which is now Rio Tinto, I think, that's where I worked. They're still running, but they have a power dam in Camano, producing all their own resources and that type of stuff. So there's enough money coming into that place that keeps it going. So I guess, when I look at a lot of the small towns around Alberta, I think Yogi made a good comment about, maybe having a couple of oil wells in the back 40 bring some revenue in, kind of keep things running when the times get rough. The tax base may be falling when some of these original resources move away or get depleted. Can those types of services be continued in that environment? We can ask ourselves now with wind turbines and solar farms and all that, are we going to rent out parts of the back 40 that we can have half a dozen windmills back there and get some revenue from the companies that put them in, just the same as what the oil companies did? Repurposing fields. Sometimes there's a point where a small farm is next to a larger one. There's amalgamation, bought out essentially, or the farm is turned into doing something different. It costs money to do that, but it may be a one way of surviving. I guess the other thing I was saying about the small fish getting eaten by the big fish kind of thing, the amalgamation, the higher volume, the move to commercialization, the move towards automation, that all is way beyond what a small farmer can do. And cattle farmers have seen that. Those who have automated and have the cows come into the milking barn and they know what to do. They just go in there and the automation takes care of it. You don't have to be the farmer that gets underneath the cow and does everything else. Um, the need for a small town to continue its existence today, I think, is, can we ask if it's self-sustaining? Does it have sustainability? We find also some small towns like down south of Calgary here, Black Diamond and Turner Valley, merging together to become Diamond Valley. So I don't know the specifics of how their structure is municipally and all that, but I'm sure there's a lot of changes like that that are on the landscape. So it doesn't really, I've raised more questions, I think, than answers here, because it's not really my bailiwick. But anyway, those are a few thoughts.
Before calling on Yogi, I'm going to ask George a point that you raised, Mel. When an assessment takes place and a community elects to be dissolved, in a corporation, a trustee would be assigned to do the wind down. Do we have any equivalent of a trustee being assigned, or does anybody get assigned to make sure the transition is orderly, George?
The municipal affairs would do through their viability review team. They would do an assessment. They would talk about what monies are required to operate the community. Is that sufficient? Can you provide that through your local assessment? At what point do we need to prop it up? And if it is taken over by a larger municipality, how do you preserve the smaller community? How do you preserve some of its identity? How do you preserve some of its goodness, if you like, some of its attraction? But I'm not aware of the full answer to that, Perry. I would need to be more in touch with municipal affairs and ask them that specific question. Like at some point, they would then go to their citizens and say, "Now we're prepared to wind up, go through some bankruptcy proceedings, and we're prepared to become a part of our rural neighbor, who, by the way, we might have had lousy relationships with the last 25 years, but we're now going into bed with them. And here's what we get out of the deal. We get better services, we get sustainability, our taxes will decrease, our services will increase. What's not to like about that? All of that kind of stuff happens in the course of a community becoming dissolved. So there's to some extent, there's a win-win. But it's ironic, by the way, because for years, people like me have been pushing the notion of rural urban working together, particularly in the area of recreation, where you've got major recreation complexes like the one we have in Spruce Grove, where we actually have our neighbors contributing to what's called the Tri-Leisure Center, the Spruce Grove, Stony Plain, Parkland County, all cooperating their dollars, their resources, their population. Without that kind of cooperation, those things don't come to be, those things don't exist. And so and yet you have larger municipalities. They don't need the rural to, Calgary's and Edmontons and Red Deers can do it on their own. St. Albert did their recreation complex, as I remember, on their own because they had asked Sturgeon County to be a part of it. And I think the answer was no. That's my recollection. So, the need for cooperation between municipalities is never greater than it is today. And a lot of that is around high cost facilities, and some of it's around the regionalization of water and sewer services.
Can a municipality sell itself to a corporation? Could a corporation, I think about the Middle Ages in Europe, and you've seen a castle that actually owned the local town. Has a corporation ever put in a bid to own a town?
Not that I'm aware of, and I suspect that would not be responded to very positively by either the province or by the general public of Alberta.
But you can see the merit of actually having the housing there, having plants, having some infrastructure, and a corporation capital.
Well, yeah, let me take back some of the comment, because I did a session for Gimli, Manitoba, and the municipality of Gimli, Manitoba was largely propped up in there because of the industry that was located there. So it was the industry that drove the whole thing. The industry was the one taxpayer. And so council could make whatever decisions it wanted to, but it still had to go to the industry and say, may I, before the decision was approved. So you had industry dominating municipality.
We've been busily talking about the trends that are emptying out rural Alberta, but I wonder if we're on the cusp of some trends that will at least flatten this out or perhaps even reverse it. And I'm thinking of a couple of things. First of all, this whole working from home phenomena and the expansion of the internet into rural Alberta and other rural areas those two come
Mhm.
together because I think there's quite a few people who would like to actually live in a slower, calmer place with less traffic and perhaps less noise than we experience in an urban setting. And I know there's a bunch of people who enjoy the rural area from a recreation point of view, be it hunting or fishing or hiking. Uh, and so there's a segment of the population that's attracted to this alternate lifestyle as long as there's sufficient uh, infrastructure. And the one thing that I'm mentioning is high-speed internet. Maybe that's all it takes. Uh, George talked about the water systems. We have electricity almost everywhere, and the water disposal systems. Maybe that's all it takes. It may not even take much of a road. Gravel might be good enough.
Well,
And
we spoke of the superhighway, what, 20 years ago, when that was an argument on how to continue to keep rural Alberta viable. And the telecommunications industry balked as them did not want to bear the cost of the infrastructure if the economics weren't there. But I mean, you're certainly onto one of the promises that the internet made to rural communities is this will help make you viable. And I think Elon Musk is making the same argument with his satellite infrastructure.
anyway, I just thought I'd throw out a countervailing trend to what we've been talking about.
Well, I think I think it's highly significant. I mean, China is wrestling with that right now, and we're not alone in this discussion. In fact, we're rather late to the game. One of the interesting things, though, about Canada on a ranking, I looked at the worldwide ranking of urbanization, and Canada is much higher than you would believe because of the density in the urban centers along the border. Forget what's north of Edmonton. In fact, almost forget what's north of Calgary. But you look at the way the population and how dense it is across that border, across this country, you can understand we are viewed on scale as a relatively dense population. 80% of the population is urban based. So this issue is ours. And the homelessness issue is not surprising, has risen to the surface as quite a significant issue in Canada, even though it has basically geographically a rural diversity, but its population is densified in its urban centers, although it's got sprawl problems. When you talk about moving out of the city, they move to the suburbs. They don't move rural, they move neighborly. And that creates, suburbs create a problem for urban centers because they take the best and often leave gutted. Go ahead, Shirley.
I was going to agree with what Yogi was saying because there's a lot of things that are happening that I think would drive people away from these mega cities. I have been in Edmonton all my life, so it's gotten too big for me. There's too much traffic. The commutes are long. The densification that I'm seeing is huge. People since the pandemic, they don't want to go downtown to work anymore. They prefer to, as Yogi mentioned, kind of work at home or hybrid. They don't want to go downtown full time anymore. Downtown has been dying slowly for years and years. I find the smaller communities becoming more and more attractive. I think you have to have a certain size and a certain amount of amenities to attract people. But I know that I have taken space for granted in my life. And I go to some of these new communities and there's not even any place to park. It's changing for the future for sure. And if I had the ability to, I would definitely consider going to a smaller community.
Well, the focus of a series that CBC was doing this week was on the urban pain, not so much the rural. And it was focused very much on the need for densification to go vertical instead of continue to go into sprawl, and the massive problems of transportation that they were arguing Vancouver's done a much better job than Toronto in solving. But I mean, one of the reasons I moved to Canada and have stayed here is I grew up in an environment on Long Island where my dad, in order to get a good job, spent an hour and a half in the morning and an hour and a half at night in a commute. So he spent 3 hours or 15 hours a week for 40 years of his life traveling to and from work. I mean, I refuse to face that. And there was no air conditioning in his days. And you know, just I'll carry this on just one more cycle. I would meet my dad with my sisters in pajamas at 7 o'clock at night as he got off the commuter train, and my mom had fed us and bathed us, and there we were meeting our dad getting off the train. So he said to me one day, you could always tell at what stage of a career a rider on the Long Island Railroad was at, because in the first stage of their career, they were doing correspondence. In the second stage of their career, they were reading books. In the third stage of their career, they were networking with friends, maybe playing poker. In the fourth stage of their career, their wives were taking them out of the club car, soused out of their minds, having drank for an hour and a half. But you could see there was a whole life cycle to an employee commuting to get a better, to raise their children in the suburbs and to work in the urban area. And I think urbanization is now, for New York, runs from Washington, D.C. to Boston and right down to Atlanta. The whole coast is becoming urbanized. And until climate change hits and they can't live there anymore, that'll probably continue. It's the West Coast as well. Now we've got Calgary to Edmonton. It's the infill is occurring. And someone mentioned rail. They've talked about putting rail east-west through Red Deer in order to bring the Wainwrights and the Drayton Valleys all into play. That's been a hard sell. And getting high-speed rail between Edmonton and Calgary has been a hard sell. But as the population increases and the economic opportunities increase, that's more possible.
I would pick up on what Yogi's comment about perhaps there's more interest in moving to small communities. And I have one example. I was down in Milk River and I met a young couple that moved from Vancouver. And they were able to buy a house in Milk River and run it. They're running a little shop down there with the money that they could never have done that in Vancouver. So there was a couple other instances like that, and I forget who told me, but there's this movement from Vancouver, the West Coast, into Alberta because it's more economically viable to do that. So maybe for small municipalities, some opportunity to look at that. Okay, so I'll just stop there for the moment.
The exiting from Vancouver has really been to the benefit of Kelowna, and you've seen the rapid growth in the last 20, 40 years into Kelowna. It's been massive. But I mean, as I alluded to, even in the Bonnyvilles, in Alberta, the oil and gas industry has allowed small communities to be viable. But a transition is underway in forestry. I mean, sawmills are being abandoned. The increased usage of certain technologies has reduced the need for some of the field. And as a result, some of the smaller towns, even with the oil and gas coming back, have not benefited to the extent they had earlier. So resource-based economies are suffering from the emerging industry of the emerging nations and the viability in South American forestry as forestry products. So oil and gas, we've done very well because of the being the fourth largest supplier of oil and gas worldwide. Alberta is and will continue to benefit, but smaller communities may not be the biggest participants. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I think a couple of points that made by Yogi and Shirley, I think bear some thought, and that's what attracts people to move away from the densification that's happening in places like Edmonton, Calgary, and so on. And I think it's pure lifestyle choice. If people have an opportunity to move where there's less of a hassle, where there's less of a commute, there's less of a potential of running into what they don't want to run into, which probably is homelessness amongst other issues. I think you end up, if you're in a surrounding community around a large urban center, you have some opportunity to have some net migration toward your community that I think may not have been thought about earlier. So I think the opportunities to move to smaller communities are still there. My example of Hilda, Alberta, because I stopped and talked to somebody who came to their front door in a house that my wife's parents used to own. And we said, where are you from? And he said, Vancouver. So this just reiterates the point being made. And said, why are you there? And he said, well, he said, I used to be a trucker. I no longer truck. I don't have to be in the Vancouver region. I like the quietness here. I can still get access to all of my services in Medicine Hat. I'm close enough to hospitals and so on. I think if you're within commuting distance of a larger center, there's some potential. If the further out you are, it's largely farming community that needs to be there. So the communities within, say, a 1 hour radius of Edmonton or 1 hour radius of Calgary, Red Deer, I think have a much stronger opportunity to survive than our northern communities or our very southern communities. Now, that would be my guess, at least.
Yeah, I think adding to that, um, this business of our economy within the various municipalities is a great factor. So example, oil and gas, a number of rural municipalities have not had their property taxes paid for, their linear property taxes. And so there's a number of them that are really suffering cash flow wise because they've gone under or they're not paying. So this comes back again to what's the diversity of the area, the economy, and so on, relative to the small communities. And without diversity, and we're continually rely on oil and gas, then of course it's limited as to what the small communities can do. The other point about people living there, really, it's a demographic too. Is that we've talked to a number of older people about moving to a smaller community. The problem there is that you don't have the health care, and as you age, you have many more appointments. And you just can't be driving back and forth to Edmonton or to Calgary to get this specialized treatment. So that's a real hindrance for small municipalities. In fact, that creates the migration out of the small communities because they got to move to the larger centers. Certainly Medicine Hat, Red Deer, and so on, at least to get a certain level of care.
Yeah,
so that's another problem.
I saw that in dealing with services for people with disabilities back in the 70s, and we could see the flood potentially coming into the city for services because we were developing services in the city that didn't exist in rural areas. And so we concentrated the development of group homes and vocational training centers almost to intercept those populations in the Barheads and the Fort McMurrays and the Vermilions and the Vegrvilles, and it worked. They got integrated into schools. They had answered the question, what happened when I'm gone? But we had to concentrate on rural Alberta to reduce the pressure on urban Alberta. And I know that the Alberta government some years ago put hospitals in and around the province. And they got criticized for doing that when they were underutilized. And I wonder whether those hospitals are convertible today, or whether the schools that are being abandoned are convertible today into community care centers. Mel, you had another point you wanted to make?
Yeah, just a few days ago, there was a document circulated. It was the University of Calgary research paper, Small Alberta Towns, Villages, Serious Challenges Due to Population, Job Issues, etc. I read that and kind of got interested in it a little bit. And as Jeff knows, I've been playing around with a different AI. So I figured if this thing has been recently trained, some of the information that we're talking about here has been part of its training material. So I had a little conversation with it, and in the very end, if I can share my screen here, I asked it a question. So that question basically was, as a bottom line answer to this not so simple concern, which is the small towns that we're talking about, what might be the 25, 50, and 100-year solution to this? So many of the things that have been brought up, Yogi mentioned a number of them here too, as did George. Some of the consolidation, we talked about the thing I mentioned with Diamond Valley and Turner Valley, I guess, and Black Diamond merging. Attracting remote workers. As we have more immigration and stuff like that, we're going to presumably, hopefully, get more younger people coming in. We can't necessarily mandate that they go out there, but we can create environments that would pull them out there. So in the 25 years time frame, we'll see gradual transition supported by retraining, some diversification, regional planning. There's a little bit of money infusion here. Going a little further out, a mix of outcomes, where we have towns that are unable or unwilling to diversify. Maybe you just can't do it. They'll continue a gradual decline. There are going to be some that fall off the edge of the cliff, but others can leverage new opportunities, specialty crops. There's going to be a lot of new things. Yogi mentioned remote work. Living out in the country brings, for younger people anyway, That's most of the population compared to my age right now. But the younger people can still do work remotely as we increase our broadband and amenities and that type of stuff. So if we then go 100 years out, significant population shifts. We're going to have a different population in this country in 100 years than we do today. And people can't all live in large cities. We're not going to have 30, 40, 50 story apartment buildings and that type of thing. That's not what they want to do. So there will be, it will support a number of individuals that can't afford a house, so they'll hopefully rental will be within their capability and they can get into that. Towns reliant on non-depletable local resources, geothermal, etc., they have the wherewithal to continue their life. And in summary, I think without careful economic diversification and facilitation of new opportunities, as this thing says, and you probably already read it, new strategic investment in infrastructure, all of that type of stuff. You were talking about the study to provide some ideas to government. If they can pick up on some of those things, there may be part of the solution there that we're all striving to achieve. So anyway, I'll leave that there, and if we want to go past the 100 years, that'll be way beyond my time.
Okay, thank you. You can remove that. I copied it. I'll be drawing on that for the summary. One of the points you made in there touches on an issue that we haven't discussed today that is associated and maybe even worse than what we've talked about, and that is the plight of our Indigenous First Nations populations that are out in rural Alberta. They're almost an island within an island. When I was out at the Frog Lake Nations and I stood in front of those 200 students looking at me and talking about, what do they want to be when they grow up, and getting these blank faces back. And I'm thinking about retraining and thinking about where the economies are for the young people that are being born in these communities. We often think about the older, but the younger ones that are coming into the cities, we see them among the homeless. Not these high school students, not yet. But if we don't get a grip on how to manage the transition from a rural to an urban environment, for some of these people, they will suffer on arrival, as many of the homeless are now. Secondly, and a point we also didn't discuss at any great length, the baby boomer population is massive and it's aging. And it will be exiting as young people migrated. They'll be exiting to try and get access to services that today are basically centric to cities. That is not a small population. That is a massive, almost a tsunami of numbers. And as many of you know, I'm going through that myself, not personally, but with my wife, of looking for services that if they're not proximate, you've got to travel. And people will want to leave if they don't get them out there. So these are a number of points that hopefully will surface through this webinar, through maybe other webinars in our survey, as a reminder or as an alert that if rural communities aren't being heard, maybe we can help complement their voice or add to their voice through what we're doing here.
I talked briefly about work from home, and what I really mean is hybrid, where the person with the job spends some of the time at home and some of the time in the office, i.e. with some commuting. And one of the things that COVID told us is that education from home doesn't work. The children need social interaction. And your comment about how much commuting time your father endured made me realize that there's a limit to how far we can bus children to school as well. So I wonder if the education system is going to evolve into a hybrid situation for rural children. So I just wanted to bring in that education dimension.
Yeah, and Yogi, I think adding to that is what is AI going to do in terms of education? I mean, that's going to change. I know it's hard to fathom, but it's going to change how we actually educate people. And that can affect certainly elementary school all the way up.
Yeah,
so I think that's a big factor.
Yeah, good point for bringing that up, Dennis, but given how cautious and sometimes even backward our education system is K-12, I think it's going to be a while before AI changes things there, but it probably will be less than a generation.
Oh, yes, I think so. And to some degree, I think we gotta be a bit bolder in our approach to doing these things because the universe is changing so fast and we're still trying to figure out how we're gonna save a small town, man, we've got to get with it, I think.
Well, I mean, 2 points that have been made today, Dennis. One is it's probably inevitable in some instances, and assessments are helping to understand that, in which case the challenge is one of the transition. I mean, Kubler-Ross talks about the 5 stages of dying from denial,
Yeah.
etc. And whether that's the role of economic development officers or trustees, but there is going to be the need to help communities in that transition of amalgamating or winding it up. And then the second one is, of course, for those that have potential, what can be done and what support can be made available without it becoming long-term subsidies. And you've made that point well. Is at some point in time, enough is enough. I mean, the urban taxpayers will revolt, and so they should when subsidies are excessive. We've seen that in agriculture as Alberta loses its advantage because other communities start planting their hundreds of thousands of acres. We may have something like hemp that comes in for a while and provides an alternative. But there's a dynamism here that for all of us in this group find interesting. I think the topics that we find interesting are these very dynamic, where there is no singular answer and where management needs to be applied and possibly with the assistance now of AI because of the complexities. And with the number of communities we have, I mean, 317 at our last count in Alberta and double that number, interestingly, in Saskatchewan. They've got twice the problem that we have. But
we keep Perry, we keep propping this up because most of the municipalities will not survive unless they have provincial grants coming to them.
Right.
And where you have marginal communities, there's not enough money to keep them going, and yet they keep floundering, and we're not finding the solution on how to deal with them. So anyway, big problem.
Some among us think enough is enough, that it's time to face the fact that some of these communities are not viable, and it is time to possibly be somewhat assertive in bringing them into closure. And that's why I raised the question of, are economic development officers trained at all to help a community go through what Kubler-Ross talks about, the 5 stages of dying?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
I know they're not. They're like doctors told.
They're supposed to make it grow, and that's where they get to grow it.
Right.
But I think when we talk about, if you were to amalgamate some, you could then take those resources into larger bodies that have more resources and so on to be able to keep a small community going, but it's part of the bigger picture,
Well, George cited that 50% of those that have been identified for amalgamation have in fact gone forward, that their communities have voted in favor. So that's 50% anyway. That's a bigger number than I think many would have expected in their role, and nostalgia plays is a big one. But clearly it's not a topic that's going away. Hopefully we've elevated some level of awareness among us, and the survey, which will be done by the end of the month, will hopefully complement this discussion, and we'll go forward with it.